Welcome into a Friday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you've had a great week. I've had a good week. I'm ready for the weekend, though. Looking forward to watching some championship college football. That, unfortunately, will not include the Indiana Hoosiers in the Big Ten championship, but looking forward to this, watching some good football. The final weekend before we get the official complete college football playoff rankings bracket, whatever you want to refer to it as, that will all come to its dramatic conclusion at the end of the weekend. So looking forward to finding out all of that. We've also got Indiana basketball tonight against Miami of Ohio, another tune-up game before they enter conference play for a brief time. And hopefully they can put in another solid performance to build off what they did against Sam Houston on Tuesday. Got a lot of things to go over, by the way, here on a Friday. Of course, we'll talk more about Indiana basketball and what they've done as of late with Alec Lasley. Going to do that on today's show. Also going to talk about a bunch of different Indiana football matters, not just the college football playoff rankings and where the Hoosiers most recently landed, but some big news was announced yesterday. Good and bad, and honestly, it's mostly good. And it's very fitting based off of kind of what I talked about earlier this week and kind of worrying about what Curt Cignetti's staff might look like in the future. We kind of got some answers to that. And we'll dive into that a little further with Alec Lasley, so I don't want to talk too much about that. But I'll give you the short end of it while I've already mentioned it, and that is co-offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach Tino Sunseri. He is moving on at the end of the season to become the offensive coordinator at UCLA. So he will remain with Indiana for the college football playoff. But other than that, he is heading on to something to, I don't want to call it greener pastures. It makes it sound like he didn't like what he did in Indiana. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But some good news that they kind of offset some of this is that 9 of Indiana's remaining assistants are expected to stay on staff with an increase in pay. And on top of that, strength and conditioning coach Derek Owings plans on remaining with Indiana. So some good news to, like I said, offset the bad news of Tino Sunseri unfortunately moving on. But hey, when you're a co-OC and you want to be an OC, especially for a power program, whether it be at the Big Ten or the SEC or even one of the other power conferences that aren't necessarily on the same level as the Big Ten or the SEC, makes complete sense. And I don't think anybody would be surprised if they told you that Tino Sunseri would have found another job. Now, what people would be surprised about is hearing that everybody else on staff is going to still be around. I mean, Mike Shanahan, Bryant Haynes, Bob Bostad, John Miller, you name an assistant. They're all staying from what I can tell. And now anything can change between now and the beginning of next season. But this just goes to show that we are living in a new era of Indiana football where it shows that, like, the investment that has been made into this program, this is the part of the fruits of that investment. Obviously, you have what's going on this season, and now you're building. This was the foundation. Now you're building for recreating this level of success in the future, and knowing that you're only going to have to find one new staff member this offseason to. And granted, it is an important position, your quarterback's coach, and whether or not they end up being a co-OC like Tino Sunseri was, that remains to be seen. But I have full confidence that Curt Cignetti already has a short list of guys he is going to be in contact with to become Indiana's new quarterback's coach. And there may be people coming to knock on the door to be Indiana's QB coach now that they've seen what this staff is able to do in this new look Big Ten. So again, that's all that I'll share my thoughts. Actually, there is one more thing I do want to mention because I don't talk about this with Alec Lasley. One thing that doesn't make it, again, as surprising that Tino Sunseri is moving on to UCLA specifically is his relationship with Deshaun Foster. They apparently crossed paths while they were both with the Carolina Panthers at some point. I don't know if it was as coaches or as players, but there is some sort of connection there. And honestly, whether they have that connection or not, it's really not that surprising. Because again, any sort of power job, and I'm going in a circle with it. Any power job could have come calling and maybe money wouldn't have mattered. Sunseri is a rising star in college football, and he will more than likely, especially if he's successful at UCLA, he will become a college football head coach, I would say, within the next year or two, if he continues on the trajectory that he's been on. So shout out to him for getting a new opportunity, and I hope he does well, except for against Indiana whenever they return to Bloomington to face the Hoosiers next season. So yeah, there's some Indiana football news for you. Also, let's go ahead. I mentioned I was going to do a little signing day stuff. I didn't do any of that with Alec Lasley, so I will do a little bit of that here while I've got you. So I'm not going to sit here and bore you with recruiting statistics and, give you star ratings, their numbers. I'm just going to give you their name, their position, and where they're from. And so Indiana had a total of 21 players, I believe, signed their letter of intent a couple of days ago to be freshmen on next year's Indiana Hoosiers football team. And this class, I believe, ranked, I don't have the ranking in front of me, I believe it was 13 or 14. Again, I could be wrong. I know it's somewhere in that range of the Big Ten. And it's better than where Indiana usually is when it comes to their conference recruiting ranking. But I think what's going to be more important going forward for Indiana, especially under Cignetti, is what that portal class looks like. So if your freshman class, if it can be a complement to your portal class, that's really what you're looking for this day and age in college football. Now, before I go through these names, I'm going to take a drink of water because I don't want to, you know how I do, right? Sorry for the extended pause. Probably saw me shuffling around, almost losing my bottle cap too right there. So without further ado, here is your list of future Indiana Hoosiers. We'll start with Garrett Reese. He is a safety out of LaGrange Park, Illinois. Next is Matt Merrick, an interior offensive lineman from Orland Park, Illinois. We have Zachary Smith he's a corner from Atlanta, Georgia. Andrew Barker, a tight end, first in-state guy, Kokomo, Indiana. Kyler Garcia, defensive lineman, Nashville, Tennessee. Paul Nelson, a linebacker from Cincinnati, Ohio. Another in-state guy, Evan Parker, interior offensive lineman from Carmel, Indiana. Keyshawn Coleman, defensive lineman from Groveport, Ohio. Miles Kendrick, wide receiver from Jacksonville, Florida. Jamari Farmer, a linebacker from Mooresville, North Carolina. Baylor Wilkin, interior offensive lineman from Findlay, Ohio. Jarevius Hall, defensive lineman from Columbia, Tennessee. LeBron Bond, wide receiver from Norfolk, Virginia. Sean Cuono, a running back from Clearwater, Florida. Jalen Bell, a corner from Loganville, Georgia. Ciante Stewart, a corner from Cincinnati, Ohio. Blake Thyree, a tight end from Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Davion Chandler, a wide receiver from Indianapolis. And, of course, he was somebody that Indiana flipped from Illinois, I believe, before the season even started this past fall. Next, we got Tristan Abram, an edge rusher from St. Louis, Missouri. Tyrone Burris Jr., another edge rusher from Indianapolis. I believe also this was the recent flip from Louisville to Indiana. And then finally, rounding out the class, who's of signed letter of intents, is safety Byron Baldwin from Baltimore, Maryland. Again, somebody who formerly committed to Indiana, then decommitted, was believed to potentially go, I believe, to Colorado, and then ended up recommitting and now signing his letter of intent to become a Hoosier. So shout out to Indiana's freshman class of 2025, I should say. But high school seniors, 2025 is probably a better way to phrase it. But we'll see how big of an impact any of these guys make in year one. I mean, I don't believe there's a high number of freshmen, or maybe any freshmen at all, at least that I can recall off the top of my head, that have been a major part of this Indiana football team, at least for in terms of on-field production. And we'll wait and see. Again, none of that. What the production value of any of these guys, we'll see where it all stacks up, because a lot of it's going to depend on what kind of guys you get in the transfer portal, what guys leave Indiana to pursue other opportunities. And there's so many different pieces to the puzzle that will need to be fit together before next season to see what we're working with. And it's a fun ride to watch, because it's also a very complicated ride to keep your eyes on. Love that water. I'm not drinking coffee. Some of you may know what that means. And y'all know I love being overly transparent. I'm recording this on a Thursday night, and you also may realize this too. They released earlier. Normally, lately, I've been having some late releases for In Touch with Indiana Sports, just because of my schedule. But because I'm going to be at work a lot later tomorrow, I had to go ahead and knock out today's show beforehand. So welcome to you guys listen whenever you want. I don't know what time of day each and every one of you listen. Some of you I know are immediately when the show publishes, and I appreciate that. Some of you are late night listeners, at least based on whenever I see some of your comments. And whatever you're doing, whenever you listen to this show, I just hope you're enjoying yourself, and I hope I'm doing my best to make this worth your time. I want to continue to talk about the transfer portal for a second, and then we will get into I got a list of things I want to get into here. I'm trying to figure out where to fit in my Alec Lasley segment. But while we're talking portal and recruiting, one thing I do want to mention, this is pretty important. Curt Cignetti has said that he will definitely pursue a transfer portal quarterback addition for next season. Now, does that mean it's somebody who's automatically going to come in and, be as good as Curtis Rourke? I mean, I don't know, maybe. I initially thought that Taven Jackson may have been the quarterback in waiting, and maybe he ends up winning the job against whoever Curt Cignetti ends up pursuing and getting in the transfer portal, but maybe not. I don't know if that would say more about the transfer coming in or more about Taven Jackson. Of course, we'll have to see who that ends up being. But, I mean, I think Curt Cignetti is fully aware that there is going to be I'm not going to say every quarterback's going to be knocking on the door of Bloomington to come in and play for Curt Cignetti, but there's going to be a whole lot more than you would have expected in previous seasons. And he's going to have to hand select the very best guy for his system. And I think Cignetti's going to love having all of those options at his disposal. And it's unfortunate for the guys who are already on the roster. It doesn't mean that they're not capable of winning the starting job. Maybe, like I said, maybe Taven Jackson ends up taking enough steps forward to show that he's the guy, or maybe he's just a career backup, or maybe he ends up jumping back in the transfer portal, considering there is no rules for things like that. I mean, a lot of people thought, I guess whenever it was initially a one-time transfer, that when he came from Tennessee to Indiana, that he was just going to stay there. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Taven Jackson did jump in the portal before Cignetti was the head coach, and then ended up returning. But he's definitely a solid option one way or another. And I do think if Taven Jackson did end up being your starter next season, I don't think that would necessarily be a bad thing. Now, would it be as good of what you got with Curtis Rourke this season? I don't know. Again, that's you never know how good someone's going to be. And I guess one thing we have seen Taven Jackson in a starting position going back to Tom Allen's final year. Of course, that was just kind of an unfortunate situation for him, the way that they went with two starters, and then they named him the starter, and then it went back to Brendan Sorsby, and it was just kind of a mess. And he's had his opportunities this year. He's had more opportunities than anybody really could have imagined with him, considering there was a lot of chances in the early going whenever Indiana was blowing out teams, and he was able to take some snaps in those games. Then he was able to take more important snaps whenever Curtis Rourke had some injury issues. Of course, midway through the Nebraska game, did the entire second half, and then played the entire game against Washington and was able to help Indiana secure victories in both. Now, you were playing from ahead in the Nebraska game, so it's a lot easier to play from ahead than from 0-0, but he was still able to get the job done, even though it wasn't super impressive numbers from him in that Washington game. But maybe that's what it is. Maybe Taven Jackson isn't the exact style of, of quarterback that Cignetti wants. Maybe he wants someone that can sling it around a little more. And I think he has that ability to do so. I think he just kind of needs to get out of that shell in some way, shape, or form. And maybe, I don't know, for some reason, there are times where I feel like Indiana plays a little more conservative on offense whenever Taven Jackson is in, or they're a little more run heavy. But who knows? Maybe I'm overthinking it. But I do think it's a good thing that Cignetti is willing to go into the portal, even though I wouldn't have been upset if he chose to not go into the portal, because I do think he's got a good line of quarterbacks that, if developed correctly, can end up being good starters for you in the future. Of course, like I mentioned, Taven Jackson, you got 2 more years. After that, you got either Alberto Mendoza or Tyler Cherry, the freshman, who I both will redshirt this season. So if those guys stay around, we'll see. I mean, how often are we ever going to see a freshman quarterback truly become the guy? Unless there's somebody like a Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, who was just so highly touted out of high school that you couldn't wait to put him on the field. He was ready to go immediately, even though he was still a freshman, right? If you're a freshman, it is harder than ever to find early minutes. And even if you don't get on, I mean, it's hard to know whether or not you're going to get an opportunity at all. You almost have to move down to the G5 level if you're not somebody who has the ability to play immediately. So it's just as tough for the players to navigate as it is for the coaches, this transfer portal nonsense, as some may call it. But yeah, just wanted to share that little piece of information that Cignetti shared with us. And we'll continue to we'll check out what happens. I mean, it is portal season, right? Even though we are squarely in the heading into the offseason, the postseason, I should say, for Indiana football with the college football playoff, doesn't mean recruiting stops. I mean, we're, like we said a year ago, this was Cignetti, his first few days on the job, piecing together his roster. I mean, that doesn't change, even though Indiana's in the postseason now. So a lot of crazy stuff going on, and look forward to continuing to follow it all. And then I do want to go over a couple of big college basketball results. I know I don't like to ignore. I feel like I've ignored college basketball way too much in favor of football. And again, I know rightfully so, based on the amount of good things that have come from football, specifically from the Hoosiers. But that doesn't mean that I can't ignore the big things going on in CBB, right? And then after this, we'll get into our conversation with Alec Lasley. But last night, rival Purdue goes down to Penn State in the conference matchup and stormed the court on them. I mean, this is the one reason I want to talk about this, other than just Purdue losing. Is court storming, like, it's fun, like, but I feel like it's so outdone, right? And I think we've seen so many field stormings too in college football this year. And by the way, and I know I'm unlocking myself, but this is something I've thought about throughout the season. I don't know if I've mentioned it on the show. Indiana had their rise to where they're at now for football, and they never had their field storming moment, right? And maybe, I don't want to look too deep into that, but maybe that helps add to a little bit of like this Indiana team not feeling like they've arrived, right? Because a lot of these teams have their moments where they knock off their top 3 or 4 or 5 team, whatever it may be, and they get to celebrate with the team on the field, and it's fun and all that good stuff. But Indiana never had that opportunity because they played so many teams where, not everyone they played at home was bad, but they never played somebody who was, at that elite caliber level. And so there was never a reason for the fans to storm the field. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. Very interesting that Indiana football, of all things, never had their field storming. They've never stormed the field since I've been a fan. I know they did it back whenever they hit a game-winning field goal against Purdue when Terry Hepner, or it wasn't Terry. I don't think it was Terry. I think it was Bill Lynch. Right after Terry Hepner had, I think he had passed away already. Again, don't want to sit there and just speculate on things I don't remember exactly. I know that was after he was no longer the coach, and I believe Terry Hepner had already passed away at that point. And that was the play 13 season? Maybe I'm wrong. Either way, you all know, many of you, I'm sure, know what I'm talking about, even if I am in the ballpark of things right there. Anyway, back to what I was talking about with college basketball results. Of course, Penn State upsets Purdue. We had number 1 and number 2 both fall the other night. Creighton knocks off number 1 Kansas 76-63 in the Big 12 Big East battle. Very big for them after Creighton, similar to Indiana and UConn, had a very poor showing in their MTE. And if you remember, Creighton was supposed to be in the battle for Atlantis along with Indiana before they got invited to play in that NIL tournament. I think it was called the Players Era Tournament, something like that. But Creighton, for the second straight season, knocked off Kansas at home and giving them their first loss in the season. And I don't know if they stormed the court on them, but if they did, then, just continues my point. And then moving on to another upset, and this is not so much of really Creighton over Kansas isn't super surprising, but neither is this next one. Duke at home against number 2 Auburn. They knocked them off 84-78. It was a top 10 matchup. So, even though it was an upset, it's still, 2 top 10 teams battling it out. But Auburn, being number 2 makes it where both number 1 and number 2 fall in the same evening. This one in the SEC ACC challenge, almost mentioned the entire name because I was reading it right in front of me with the sponsor and all that stuff. That would have been goofy. But parity in college basketball. We're no stranger to parity in college basketball anymore, are we? There's so much of it going on, and it's now bleeding over into football. And some people might not like that. I, of course, love it because that means my team is doing well. Because without all this shakeup, we wouldn't have Indiana what they're doing right now. And it is funny. I do feel like I keep relating all of this back to Indiana football, and I'm not trying to do that, I promise. But it does seem like I've done that a few different times. But since I've gone through everything I wanted to go through before I push us into our Alec Lasley segment, so I'll go ahead and do that just now. Going to continue to talk about Indiana basketball, or just go back into talking Indiana basketball and the road ahead for them. Talk a little bit more about the Tino Sunseri news and the rest of Indiana football's assistants and plenty more. So without further ado, Mr. Alec Lasley. Joining me now here it is once again, the publisher of HoosierIllustrated.com, Alec Lasley. Welcome aboard. Happy Friday, my friend.
Happy Friday. Another week almost in the books. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. And it'll be the first, I was going to say the first non-Indiana football Saturday in a while, but that's not entirely true considering they've had a couple of bye weeks. But there is more football to play, but the regular season's over. And we'll get into some more Indiana football stuff in a second. But tonight we've got Indiana basketball in another non-conference matchup against Miami of Ohio, coming off pretty big win against Sam Houston, at least when you consider the type of performance that they clocked in. When you look at what happened before in the battle for Atlantis, I feel like I've been a pretty negative Nancy on things that have taken place with Indiana basketball over the last couple of weeks. And normally I don't tend to veer into that lane, Alec, but one reason I've kind of justified that is I've made the comparison with Indiana football. And maybe this is kind of jumping the gun a little bit with this, but I wanted to go ahead and share this with you. The reason that I'm so impatient with Indiana basketball this year, not only is it just in general what's been going on the floor, not necessarily this past Tuesday, but whenever you've seen the gigantic leap that football has taken, and it feels like Indiana basketball has been kind of stagnant for the last couple of years, it seems to make it a lot easier to get frustrated at some of the shortcomings from the basketball side of things.
Yeah, I think that is fully understandable, right? I mean, the stagnant is a very good phrase to put on it. The way that the basketball program's been trending or not really trending in any sort of direction, just kind of flatlining almost. It's obviously a bit disappointing the way that everything went down last week in the Bahamas, especially with that being such a critical week, such a critical few games to really kind of highlight what their non-conference slate would end up being, and to kind of go into obviously on Tuesday, right? A much better showing, all in all. But yeah, I think you saw a little bit of that disappointment. Just not a great crowd, albeit again a Tuesday night. Who knows if that had anything to play into it? But we'll see what happens tonight. Obviously, a very talented Miami team coming into town. Indiana needs to be ready. Quick turnaround then again on Monday with Big Ten play getting underway. But yeah, I think it's the the excitement for Indiana basketball is also a little bit limited because you still have the full excitement for Indiana football right now. They're still playing. It's not just a bowl game, right? They are one of the 12 remaining teams that will be competing for a national championship, and the fact that you have Indiana and national championship contender in the same sentence is why all that excitement is there, because no one in their right mind would have believed that. I think everyone was looking at 9, maybe if everything really went Indiana's way, 10 wins with that 10th win being a bowl win, right? And you're sitting at 11-1, and they've pretty much been in that conversation for one of the 12 best teams for the majority of this season now. So I think that also has obviously a lot to do with it. Is just that excitement level. But yeah, like you said, the quick turnaround that a new coach brought in, and now we're in year 4 with Mike Woodson, and you haven't really seen that jolt of energy outside of maybe the first year and a half, right? Obviously, his second year was really promising with Jalen Hood-Schifino and Trace Jackson Davis, but I think everyone can kind of look at that year now as at least through three years and 6-7 games where we're at in this season. That's the outlier when you look at everything else. So a lot that still needs to be worked on for Indiana basketball. A lot of I think disappointment through the first month of the season, but still a lot to be unfolded here, and a lot to pan out over the course of the next 3.5 months.
Well, let's talk about some of the good then, because on Tuesday when they defeated Sam Houston, they looked a whole lot better. And in particular, the guard play was a lot better. Really in general, I don't want to say it was an absolutely complete performance, but there isn't a lot you can nitpick at. You got a really good performance out of Luke Goody. I was calling it the Luke Goody game the other day. You got a really good night out of Malik Renew, and really just everything seemed to come together in a game that you would have hoped to see something like that after, things didn't go your way the previous week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's even more so the performance that Miles Rice had, in my opinion, is really what stood out to me. We knew Luke Goody was eventually going to start hitting shots, right? That was bound to happen. And it's not like he was struggling out there overall. We knew eventually his shot was going to fall. It was just a matter of time. Obviously, it's good that it happened this early in the season and it didn't drag on, right into middle of December, end of December, beginning of conference play. But the bigger thing for me is for this Indiana team to reach the potential that I think everyone still thinks that it could get to, because of the talent level on this team, which is a second weekend team in the NCAA tournament, is going to come down to whether or not Miles Rice performs at the level that everyone expected him to when he committed to Indiana this offseason. And I think you see a lot of thinking going on when he's on the floor right now instead of free flowing and just playing basketball. And I think a lot of that has to do with, Mike Woodson still having a lot of handcuffs on him. I think you look at what he did last year, and a lot of it was score first, make plays for his teammates second. This year, a lot of what he's trying to do is make plays for his teammates, score second. That's not who he is. He is a dynamic scoring point guard who needs to have needs to have the ball in his hands, but that's to score the ball. This team is going to be a lot better when he's in full attack mode, getting downhill, getting into the paint, and being the true shot creator that he is. And we saw that in the second half on Tuesday against Sam Houston. His ability to not only score at the rim, get out in transition, had a couple good mid-range jumpers as well, hit a couple threes, but a lot of what the offense showed in the second half stemmed from Miles Rice being aggressive, scoring the ball. And that just opens up so much more for this team because it draws so many more defenders there in the paint. And then he can go out and create for the Luke Goodies on the perimeter, the Mackenzie Mbakos on the perimeter, dump it off to, Omar Ballo or Malik Renew, which is a lot of what happened when you look at the final 20 minutes of that game. And, even Luke Goody and Malik Renew were the two players that spoke after the game on Tuesday. And that was a lot of what they talked about was Miles Rice's ability to get downhill and open things up for him. And obviously things look a lot better when you do have guys hitting the shots, which they weren't doing probably at the beginning of the season, and obviously what they didn't do last year. But a lot of that definitely stemmed from Miles Rice being aggressive, trying to score the ball because he's still a good passer. But I think that needs to be the big shift in this team right now is start with Miles Rice attacking to score, not attacking to make plays for his teammates, because that's when you get into him trying to think way too much about, oh, should I score this ball or, oh, should I pass it to, Mackenzie over on the wing? Should I try to get him going first? It needs to start with Miles Rice getting hot early, and that'll just open up the rest of this offense, which I think you did see in the second half there.
The way you describe it reminds me a lot of how Yogi Ferrell used to play. And of course, Yogi Ferrell, a part of two of the better Indiana teams in the last couple of decades, if we're being honest. And I'm not trying to say Miles Rice can potentially be that, but if he's able to execute in that manner and get his teammates involved by also helping himself out, therefore helping the team out, it does sound like it could be a recipe for success, and it may look a little familiar, with the Yogi Ferrell reference that I mentioned. So good stuff coming hopefully for Indiana basketball. And not only do they have Miami of Ohio tonight, but they'll open up Big Ten play against Minnesota and then on the road at Nebraska next week. What do you look for? I'm not necessarily asking you to break down each of those opponents, but what are you looking for in terms of, should they come out 2-0, 1-1? What would be satisfactory here? I kind of feel like, before I give it to you, I kind of feel like if you want to make up for some of the mishaps in Atlantis, it'd be good if you could steal one from Nebraska on the road next week.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you're looking ahead to the two Big Ten games next week, I think you have to start out 2-0. Obviously, Minnesota, not a team that one can score the ball. Two, just not a very talented team this year. So that's number one. I think that should, if Indiana struggles in that one, then there's some bigger questions that need to be answered. So I think you look more at that Nebraska game. Obviously, a very talented Nebraska team, one that's given Indiana fits over the past couple of years. A little bit of a different team, but still a lot of that core obviously still there. You look at obviously Casey Tominaga is not there, and I know I totally mispronounced that last name right there.
Tominaga. I think that's how you say it, at least.
Yeah, and so he was a big portion of what obviously they wanted to do last year and even the year before, right? With his ability to not only get hot in a hurry, but his ability to hit the three ball, and that's obviously what Indiana really struggled to defend. But you have Bryce Williams is back there. Like I said, you have Juwan Gary, and you
Connor
add in
Esigian.
Exactly, and that's what I was about to say. You add in Esigian, who Indiana obviously was heavily involved with in the transfer portal, but a guy who has, I think, kind of exceeded some of those early season expectations of what he really was going to bring. I believe he's still pretty much strictly a six-man right now. I think he started a few games with some of the injuries maybe that they've had early in the year, but he's shooting almost 50% from three. with the majority of, again, his shots coming from the perimeter. But he's averaging about 15 a game and really looking like the guy that Wisconsin had his freshman year, more so than obviously what was showcased a year ago. So you're still going to have to defend the three with Nebraska. It's a team that shoots almost 25 threes a game, so about 7, 8, 9 more than Indiana's attempting right now. So a vastly different offensive team. Still one that likes to get up and down the floor, score a lot of points, and a team that likes to not only open up the game with their ability to hit the three ball, but that opens up their ability to drive the ball as well. And they're one of the most efficient and effective teams getting to the free throw line, and not only getting there but converting. I think they're shooting about almost 80% from the foul line on like 27 attempts a game. So that's a big ask for Indiana that has struggled defending the perimeter, but more so defending the ball handlers and the dribble drive, which has obviously been a big concern, not only this year, but for Mike Wood's entire tenure. And without kind of that true shot blocker, that's where I think you get into a lot of issues. And the overhelp that we've all come to see with Indiana's perimeter play is obviously not going to be effective against Nebraska. So yeah, if you're able to steal one against Nebraska, I think you're sitting in a much better spot than what we were looking at coming into Monday here.
We'll see. That'll definitely be a very crucial matchup when Indiana gets to that point there next week. But I do want to switch gears over to Indiana football. I do want to talk a little bit about the rankings. But before that, a piece of news that came out yesterday with Tino Sunseri. I don't know if it wasn't announced. It was reported by Zach Osterman that he will be taking the offensive coordinator position at UCLA. Not a big surprise, as Tino Sunseri has been highlighted as one of the key members of Indiana's staff. But there's another wrinkle to this, and that's the rest of the assistants on Indiana's staff have all been given new deals and are expected to stay for the next season to come. I guess there's a couple things for you to unpack there, but we can just start with the Tino Sunseri news.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously a guy who's super well respected, great resume, one that obviously speaks for itself, his ability to really not only develop but highlight great quarterback play. And I think that's the big hurt, right, for Indiana is not only did he play a huge part in getting Curtis Rourke to come to Indiana, but he obviously played a huge role in his development this year. A guy that had a good career at Ohio, but a vastly different player with one season working with Tino Sunseri and obviously the rest of this offensive staff. It's going to be interesting, right, to go into a Big Ten team. We'll see what happens. Obviously,
a team that Indiana will face again next year, by the way.
Yeah, and a guy who has a lot of his hands still in the pot when it comes to the offensive, not the play calling, but the offensive schemes and system that Indiana's been, putting into place this year. But also a guy who's been with Kurt Cignetti and Mike Shanahan for quite some time, dating back to obviously the JMU days, and was with Alabama as well under Nick Saban, obviously before he jumped over to James Madison. So a guy who pretty much has had all the stops that's been needed. So not necessarily a surprise that he's going to be leaving. I think it's more of a surprise that if everything holds true, that Indiana is going to be bringing back the majority of this staff, a staff that has obviously been one of the better staffs in the entire country this year and what they've been able to do, not only with obviously a bunch of guys in the transfer portal, but they all now know the scheme and the system for a second year. You have Brian Haynes and Mike Shanahan who have been with Curt Cignetti for obviously a long time, and you have a few other assistants, but there were also some newer ones that were brought in last year. So now to keep that crew together, that was the one issue that when you look at Tom Allen and you look at the assistants that he had to replace year after year, once Indiana really started kind of reach the peak of Tom Allen's tenure, that's where things really deviated from what the kind of the projections and the expectations were for Indiana football. With Curt Cignetti, I think you have full confidence that he's not only going to be able to go out and get someone to replace Tino Sunseri, not probably at the same level because of what he's been able to do, but you have probably the utmost confidence that whoever's going to come in, and this goes for any assistant who would ever leave under Curt Cignetti, that you have a lot of confidence in what he's going to bring in. And now you have a huge pool of money to pull from. And that's why Curt Cignetti really had been pushing, even when he signed his initial contract with Indiana last year, to have a pool of money for his assistants, because he knows how valuable these guys are to his system and his scheme, but he knows how good they are as well too. And now to be able to level up in the $11 million pool that you can pull from for these assistants, that is astronomically different than what a lot of other programs are going to have. And it's not always about money, right? But if you're going to look at potentially taking a low major, mid major job, or even a really bad, power four head coaching job versus staying at Indiana as a really key coordinator for an extra year because of that money, that's what really goes a long way, is not necessarily keeping these guys for an extra 5, 6, 7 years, but keeping them for that extra year is where Indiana faulted a lot in previous years under Tom Allen, because they didn't have the money. But I think is really going to pay dividends for this coaching staff and this football program moving forward.
I mean, I was talking legitimately, I believe it was the previous episode, about just looking ahead to next season and the likelihood of when you lose guys like a Mike Shanahan or a Brian Haynes, specifically, your two biggest coordinators, your biggest pieces, who have been with you for a very long time. I was really just questioning what Curt Cignetti would do, and not like it would necessarily turn out to be something bad, but when you've been with guys who have been a part of this well-oiled machine for so long, I would have been curious to find out how Cignetti would have adjusted just to somebody new, even if it was somebody that fitted his system. It definitely would have been more than likely an adjustment in some way, shape, or form. But I don't think there's any reason to pretend that it won't be impossible. I mean, maybe you won't replicate an 11-1 season next year, but when you keep this many guys on staff, even though you are losing one who was considered to be a very crucial part with Tino Sunseri, I think it's fair to say that there will be high expectations to have another successful year next season when you retain this many people.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's going to show dividends here in the next month in the transfer portal, right? Because you have that continuity, you have the scheme in place. Now it's not about saying, hey, how is this guy really going to truly fit with Curt Cignetti in that system? Because you already know, obviously, what that defense is theoretically going to look like, what this offense, for the most part, is going to look like. Obviously, you're going to have to go out and replace what Curtis Rourke was able to do this year. You're going to have to replace a lot of production at the running back position, right? But you have the true backbone of this system in place still on both sides of the ball. Now it's about going out and finding those guys that'll fill those needs. And I think that's the bigger question, is more so on the defensive side of the ball, right? Because you had the majority of that defense come from JMU. What is that unit truly going to look like? Which players are going to actually or potentially come from who have already been on this roster for a year or two, or who's going to really step in as a key transfer from wherever Indiana is going to be looking. But I don't think a lot of people are too concerned about what the roster and what the schedule and what the record is going to look like next year, because I think Curt Cignetti's shown that whatever has kind of been thrown his way, he's going to find ways to make it a very, very successful year. And that's obviously shown with now his 14 seasons as a head coach and his 14 winning seasons as a head coach. And it's not just, winning records by, a 7-6 record, right? I mean, the majority of these seasons are, 6 games over 500. And that's difficult to replicate. But when you do it year in and year out, and you now show that at the Power 4 level, you're not only going to have assistants who are going to want to jump maybe from, traditionally better programs in Indiana and want to come to Indiana. And you're going to have players that are going to now, Curt Cignetti talked about it a lot over the last week, is the success this year. It has now opened up so many doors when it comes to the recruiting side of things that he didn't really have last year. And obviously, he still pulled in a lot of really, really good transfers that weren't JMU guys. And now you just not only will be able to replicate that, but kind of double down on everything that he's been talking about. And you now have, something tangible to show. I think that's the biggest thing that no matter who leaves, right? One, I think a lot of people have the confidence that he's going to be able to replace him at some capacity. But two, as long as Kurt Signetti is there, that system is going to be in place. And if they keep winning, which I think a lot of people expect them to do, then those doors are going to continue to open and more people are going to want to rush through the doorway to come to Bloomington.
One thing I forgot to mention, Tino Sunseri will remain on staff for the college football playoff. I didn't mention that whenever I initially mentioned what Zach Osterman had reported. So that is good news as well for Indiana as they move forward into the postseason. And speaking of that, the penultimate college football playoff rankings were released. Indiana coming in ranked number 9, seeded as number 10 due to auto bid rules, of course, meaning they would travel to face 7-seeded Georgia. And if they were to win that, they would go on to face Texas, the number 2 seed. What do you feel? How do you feel about that potential draw for Indiana? And do you think it could have been something better, worse? Just give me your overall thoughts on their updated ranking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because we've heard Kirby Smart talk all about how great the SEC is versus not necessarily throwing any shots at Indiana's way in particular, but throwing shots at different teams that maybe have been ranked higher or gotten a little bit more potential respect than kind of what the SEC's been handed this year. So it's interesting to see kind of how that goes. I know we talked, I can't remember, I think it may have been the Tennessee game that was at night when after they won that game, when he was talking post game and talked about how, if we're able to host a first round playoff game, no one wants to come in and play at Georgia, especially potentially a night game, right?
Georgia Tech nearly took care of business last week.
Exactly. So, he's a guy who also likes to put a big chip on any type of shoulder that they have there. He'll take anything, he'll twist it and make it what he wants. I think it's an interesting matchup, right? I think Indiana offensively is probably a little bit ahead of where Georgia is offensively in terms of consistency. Georgia's really struggled to put together consistent drives from start to finish throughout the game. But obviously, kind of more along the lines of that Ohio State level of an opponent than obviously what the rest of the schedule has kind of unfolded for Indiana. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the SEC championship game, right? I mean, what happens if Georgia loses? Where do they go? How are you gonna just outside of Indiana's potential path? But what happens? I guess, right? They're probably going to have to take a 3-loss Georgia. But then what happens to Alabama too? That's a 3-loss SEC team. I know they've talked a lot about some of these other teams not playing in championship games. That they're pretty much those kind of 12 to 15, 16 outside of the potential of Iowa State and Clemson. Those other teams are pretty much locked in where they are. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, especially if there's a lot of different chaos that unfolds. I think if you're an Indiana fan, you probably, I don't know if I would say you want to go anywhere between Georgia and Texas, hypothetically, but I think you probably look at Texas as that team that's probably fit a little bit better for Indiana. They haven't played as strong as a schedule as probably Georgia has, have struggled in some of those games as well. And I think either way, Indiana is going to have to play their best game of the season. I mean, these are obviously the 12 best teams for a reason. And these 12 teams are going to be, much better than what Indiana's faced all year. But, Kurt Signetti talked about it, I think when he won Big Ten Coach of the Year the other day here, that they're now in control of their own destiny, right? It doesn't matter what else happens. There's no other rankings. There's no, potential, tiebreaker to get into to the Big Ten championship game. It's all about if you win, you keep moving on. Doesn't matter if you win by 1, doesn't matter if you win by 50, right? It's a win, and it's just like the NCAA tournament, right? Survive and advance at this
That's
point.
true.
So
That's why I
it's
love this added
yeah.
intrigue in the first round. The first weekend is going to be really interesting, especially if the games are competitive. Now,
Mhm.
if the games aren't competitive, you will get a bunch of critics, and probably rightfully so, saying, "Well, we didn't need this 12-team playoff if it's going to be blowouts and stuff like that." But hopefully that doesn't end up being the case for the most part. But exciting stuff. Looking forward to finding out who Indiana ends up truly facing in this 12-team playoff. I believe we'll find out on Sunday, the day after the conference championship game. So looking forward to checking out what that ends up being, and tired of all this speculation, right? I feel like I'm going back to the beginning of the season now, whenever all I was doing was talking about what Kurt Signetti could do on the field. We finally saw that, and it exceeded everybody's expectations. Now it's this college football playoff, which of course was a pipe dream a few months ago, and it's now just a few days away from reality for an Indiana football program that is, I almost wanted to say, rose from the dead, but I don't know if they were ever alive to begin with, maybe in some way, shape, or form. But I'm definitely excited to watch some postseason Indiana football, and I'm sure you are too.
Yeah, 100%. A vastly different December than what it was last year. Although it was still an exciting December last year with the
That's true.
hiring of Signetti, but vastly different with football still to be played.
Alec, I appreciate your extended time as always, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.
I appreciate it, John. Have a good one. Enjoy the football.
Big thanks to Alec Lasley as always. Appreciate his time. Good conversation. And we'll continue to have him on as always. Him, Drew, Kyler. Love having those dudes on. Love their takes, their thoughts. And yeah, good stuff. Follow him on Twitter at Al Lasley. Check everything out going on at HoosierIllustrated.com while you're at it. A couple of at least one miscellaneous thing I want to mention, just because it's kind of comical, but and also topical. But apparently, former Patriots head coach Bill Belichick interviewed with North Carolina to become their next head coach potentially. And it would just be such a North Carolina thing to do, right? Because they moved on from Mac Brown, a former legendary head coach before he became washed up, to potentially doing the same thing with Bill Belichick. And again, it's respectable to hire somebody who has had that level of success, but when they're in the twilight years of their career, how much can you really get out of somebody like Bill Belichick? And with the fact that somebody like him, he's has he ever been a college head coach? I'm pulling up his resume right now because I want to be able to at least reference what he's done. So he was in the NFL beginning in the early 90s, and I don't know if he was ever a college head coach. I'm trying to see if early coaching positions. There was no, if he's been in the NFL for the entirety of his career, and now he's 72 years old. How serious of a candidate could somebody like Bill Belichick be for the North Carolina job? How old was Mac Brown whenever he got hired at North Carolina? Mac Brown, he's currently 73, and he began his second stint at North Carolina. Let's see, back in 2019, which would have been, I guess, 5 years ago, making him 68 years old. But you'd be hiring somebody who's already nearly the exact same age as Mac Brown is currently. I mean, if you only want to use Bill Belichick as kind of a bridge head coach before you find somebody else, I mean that could work for you. I just don't see a world where Bill Belichick would want to deal with things like the transfer portal, and I mean, I guess NIL is similar to dealing with salaries, but like, how much of that was like his responsibility? He didn't have to like sell to a recruit how much NIL he was going to be making. It's not like he's doing that with his NFL players. I feel like he'd be horrible at the college level, not because he's a bad head coach, but because of all of the extra things that come along with being a college head coach nowadays. If being a CFB head coach is not ingrained in your DNA, and you're somebody at his age trying to do that, I just don't see it working. But UNC, I'd love if you hired it because it'd be a fun story to follow, and it'd be kind of funny if he was really bad in North Carolina. But it would also be very crazy and intriguing if old 72-year-old Bill Belichick walks into Chapel Hill and takes over the ACC. I don't foresee that happening, but again, it would be fun to follow along with. So yeah, there's your weird college football story for the day. And I do want to move on. And normally this is where I do my pick'ems, and I'm going to do pick'ems, but this is going to be a little bit different. I haven't chosen immediately what I'm going to take this time. And I may not, just because what I'm going to be leaning towards here doesn't mean that I guarantee this is what I'm going to roll with my bets, because I like to sit and really sometimes overthink what I want to pick for my college football picks for the week. But I do want to go over the conference championship games and maybe let you know if I'm going to bet on it, if I might think about betting on it, what I like when it comes to the spread, that sort of thing. We'll go ahead and start with the games going on tonight. And you have the Conference USA Championship between Western Kentucky and Jacksonville State. WKU solidified their seat in the CUSA Championship by beating the exact same Jacksonville State team last week at home. This time they are traveling to Jacksonville State. They're underdogs by 4.5 points. And it's kind of weird. You just played the team you're going to play again immediately. And I see why they're underdogs against them, and being on the road. I just feel like Jacksonville State would feel some extra energy and motivation to fight back for the win after losing. So I wouldn't be surprised if Jacksonville State bounces back. But that 4.5 point spread, do I trust it? Would I trust Jacksonville State to cover that? I'm not too sure. So my guess is that I'm not going to end up betting on that game in particular. But if I were to, I'd probably go with Jacksonville State to cover, based on what I just said a few moments ago. After that, we've got a couple of bigger G5 championship games. One of them where I believe a playoff spot will be on the line no matter who wins. And that is number 20 UNLV against number 10 Boise State. And this is Ashton Genty versus, I know UNLV had a quarterback who was doing really well in the early going, who ended up sitting out after the fact. Haven't really followed UNLV much since, but they have a 10-2 record, and again are looking to play spoiler to the Broncos and kind of steal their bid to the college football playoff. And so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And is Ashton Genty for real? I tell you what, I'm looking forward to seeing him go up against some of the better teams in the college football playoff, because he could solidify himself as kind of he's already a legend at the college level, but his draft prospects may significantly increase depending on what happens, not only against UNLV, and it's more specifically what happens after that if they make the college football playoff. But I'm excited. I hope Indiana, some would say, and they're not going to end up facing Boise State in the first round, but it could be a scary good opponent for him alone, Genty alone. So I'll be looking forward to seeing how that game plays out against UNLV. And then finally, on Friday night, Tulane and number 24 Army in the American Athletic Championship. Good thing it's not Army versus Navy, considering they would have had their game anyway after the fact. So it's very odd, the way things go with Army Navy, just because they do have their lone weekend to themselves, which I believe is next weekend, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, Tulane and Army will face off, probably not for a college football playoff spot, because with Army being number 24 and both teams in the Mountain West Championship game being number 10 and number 20, it seems like it's a given that the winner from the Mountain West will be the G5 representative in this year's college football playoff. But Army had a good run, but I will say I'm disappointed with the fact that I kept betting on Army and they kept letting me down. So if that tells you anything about what I'm going to do this weekend, then yeah, I'm not betting on Army. And I did mention Boise State and UNLV. That spreads at 4. What's funny, all three of these games have spreads of 4.5. The other two games, Boise State is favored by 4.5, and then Tulane is favored by 4.5. Interestingly enough, even though they are 9-3 and Army's 10-1, I guess Tulane and John Summerall's team have a lot of momentum going their way right now. Again, not betting on Army for that specific reason because I don't trust them at that moment. But I'm also not betting against them because I'd feel wrong about doing that, and because especially if they covered, then I'd be pissed. So, moving on to the Saturday slate, and I'll go ahead and do the other G5 game first before I get into some of the big boy games. And that's Ohio versus Miami of Ohio. 9-3 Ohio versus 8-4 Miami. Miami of Ohio is 2-point favorites. And I'm going to be quite frank with you. I've not watched any MACtion this year. No team other than the ones that Indiana. Did Indiana play a MAC team this year? They played FIU from the CUSA, and then they played Charlotte, which I think they might be in the Sun Belt. I'm not too sure. But either way, the only thing I know about Ohio is that's where Curtis Rourke came from. So, don't know. And then Miami of Ohio, that's where Bill Mallory coached before he went to Indiana. That's all I can tell you about both of those two. Couldn't tell you anything about their current program. So if that tells you anything, I'm not betting on this game either. But if I was to flip a coin, I mean, I'm not going to, but I guess I'd give heads to Ohio and tails to Miami. And if you want to do that, then and bet on it that way, then suit yourself. I don't recommend it, but do what you want to do. Let's go and move in though to the other games that really matter. Oh, there is one more G5 game, and I'll spend a very short amount of time on it because again, two teams I don't really follow at all: Marshall and Louisiana Lafayette. Louisiana Lafayette favored by 5.5 points, and again, not that I don't care, but like I guess that's true. I don't really care what happens in this game, and I'm not going to bet on it. So let's look at the four big boys, shall we? We've got number 16 Iowa State and number 15 Arizona State, both battling it out for a chance at not even chance, for an automatic bid in the college football playoff. Now, they will more than likely, unless UNLV beats Boise State in the Mountain West championship game, then the winner of this game between Iowa State and Arizona State will be the auto bid team that gets the number 12 seed. Because if UNLV wins, I assume that they'll stay ranked behind Iowa State and Arizona State, meaning that then the Big 12 champion would move on to be one of those top 4 seeds that get the auto bids, or the auto buys, I should say. But what do I think is going to happen in this? I mean, Iowa State looked pretty shaky a few weeks ago, and Arizona State has really surged. I think we're going to get a really competitive game. Arizona State's favored by 2. I mean, I'd bet on Iowa State a few times this year. And I've also bet on Arizona State once, and they came through for me. Iowa State, I think they let me down. So do I ride with the Sun Devils since they've pulled through for me before? And I think if I am betting on this, it's Arizona State -2 currently. I probably would ride with the Sun Devils, but this is Matt Campbell's big moment for Iowa State. And Arizona State's head coach, if I'm not mistaken, I think this dude's really young. He may be one of the youngest college football head coaches right now, especially at a Power 4 level. I want to pull it. If I see his name, then I'll be able to recall whether or not this is the guy. Yeah, Kenny Dillingham. This is his second season. He's 34 years old. In his first year at Arizona State, he was 3-9, and he's flipped the script and gone 10-2. His conference record last year was 2-7. Now he's 7-2. That's a hell of a turnaround for Kenny Dillingham. And two kind of, I mean, Matt Campbell's been in Iowa State for a while now, but he hasn't really done a lot with it other than have just a few really good seasons. This is kind of his moment to like show, hey, we're ready to take that next step. And they could do that by winning their Big 12 conference and moving on. So this is a winner take all game, right? Loser's not going to the college football playoff here, but the winner is for sure. Next up, we'll do number 17 Clemson at number 8, or not at, but against number 8 SMU. The Tigers kind of found themselves on the outside looking in, and then Miami fell last week, and Clemson ended up sneaking themselves into the ACC championship game. And if they lose, they're clearly not going to be in the college football playoff. But if Clemson wins, does SMU stay in as an at-large? I'd be willing to think, and I think it would be deserving, especially if it's a close game. If Clemson beats SMU and gets the auto bid, I think SMU should be favored over Alabama for a spot. And some may disagree with that. But with SMU's only loss being to a BYU team, I believe in the very first game of the season, and then potentially to a Clemson team that is surging and probably has more talent than you do, I think SMU would still deserve to be in with that result. But again, you don't want to get blown out in this scenario if you are the Mustangs. What do I think happens here? Man, part of me wants to take Clemson money line. SMU's favored by 2.5 points. I may look at the total for this game too. It's 55.5. I need to look at the stats for each of these teams and see what kind of numbers they put up offensively and defensively and see if maybe that's the more favorable bet here. But I'm kind of tempted to take Dabo Swinney and Clemson just because of their championship pedigree, and they haven't really found themselves in this spot in a while, and I think they may be hungry to find themselves back in a playoff scenario. So that'll be interesting to see how that game plays out. And then the biggest of the big boys, right? The Big Ten and the SEC. We'll start off with number 5, Georgia, number 2, Texas. You heard Alec and I kind of hit on it earlier. With the fact that both of them are already kind of in each other's pod with the way that the bracket currently sets up, would they just switch places if one team beats the other? Well, more so if Georgia beats Texas, I should say. Because if Texas beats Georgia, Georgia's going to fall a couple notches, I would imagine. But I really don't know how this game's going to play out. These teams have already met once. I believe it was Texas's only loss on the season, right? I do want to confirm that while I'm chatting about that. Make sure I'm not just making that up. Because Texas is 11-1 on the season. Texas's one loss was against Georgia, 30-15. But Georgia, of course, has had some questionable results since then. Or maybe it was before then. Now I'm questioning everything, getting in me own head, right? Georgia, the fabled Bulldogs, their 2 losses have come. They got blown out by Ole Miss and then lost by 7 to Alabama earlier this season. And it'd be interesting if Texas is able to bounce back and get revenge against Georgia. I kind of hope that's the way it plays out. Actually, I don't know. I don't know really how I want this college football playoff bracket to play out. I kind of don't mind the branch that they're in right now, but part of me still wants to see like the Notre Dame scenario play out, or even I kind of like the Penn State one, just because even though it's a conference matchup, you didn't play him this year. You have the Tom Allen storyline, and I really think Indiana would hand it to Penn State, if I'm being honest. Maybe I'll change my mind after I see what happens between Oregon and Penn State this weekend. But let's go ahead and move on to that game, shall we? Oregon favored by 3.5 points, the only undefeated team remaining in college football. And how do I see this game playing out? Part of me hopes this game is competitive just for the Big Ten to look good. I feel like that would be a good thing. But I also realistically think I can see Oregon winning this game by double digits, maybe even it's like 17 points potentially, depending on how quick of a start they get off to. Oregon favored by 3.5. I think that's a safe bet. I could see Oregon really, if they have the opportunity, blow this game wide open. But we'll see what happens there. But that's your college football roundup for Championship Saturday. Looking forward to checking out some of those games. And then before we wrap things up, I do want to do our weekly non-revenue shout-outs. I haven't done that yet. We'll start with women's basketball. They're doing some good stuff right now. They recently beat Maine 78-53 at home, and then followed that up with the 67-63 victory against Southern Indiana. Good stuff for Terry Moran's squad, as they've really bounced back in a pretty good way since a couple of early season losses. And they currently sit with a 6-3 record, and they will continue on with Penn State tomorrow. And then they'll have, what is that, an 8-day break before they face Bellarmine at home. So there's women's basketball for you. Men's soccer season unfortunately came to an end. As I mentioned, they were playing number 3 Denver in the NCAA tournament. They lost 1-0, and that ended Todd Yeagley and his squad's run at another potential NCAA championship run, or College Cup appearance, I should say. But overall, good year for Indiana men's soccer. Had a very shaky start to the season, but they really found their stride, as they typically do in the latter half. And then they were able to make a run in, at least win a game in the NCAA tournament, and have a good, strong finish to the year for the most part. But they will look to capitalize and do bigger and better things next season. And then finally, women's volleyball didn't have the best season, but they did finish on a strong note. Their final 2 matches, they won 3-1 against Michigan, and then defeated Illinois in a sweep 3-0. And that concluded the women's volleyball season, as they are now moved, not them, but as the volleyball season itself has moved on to the postseason. The Hoosiers finished with a 500 record, 15-15. And, I haven't looked. Let me compare that to last year real quick. Last year, so this was definitely a step, looking at the record, 21-12, a step in the wrong direction. And I don't know what the roster itself looked like in relation last year, if they had a lot of drop-off or turnover or any of that stuff. But unfortunate they took a step backward, and hopefully they'll be able to get back on the right footing next year and have the right personnel, staff, whatever it may be, to do so. And so that will wrap up this week's episodes of In Touch with Indiana Sports. Appreciate you coming along for the ride. And I believe we're going to do a post-game wrap-up tonight, myself and Kyler Staley, for Indiana basketball versus Miami of Ohio. And then next week we'll get into conference play, of course, Indiana versus Minnesota, and then Nebraska on the road. And we'll finally find out the fate of the Hoosiers playoff spot, where they're officially going to land for the 12-team playoff, and I'm excited. I hope you're excited too. Be sure to subscribe to Hoosier Illustrated on YouTube. Leave a comment on anything that I've talked about or that you want to share your thoughts on, and I'll may share it on the show in a future episode. Or you can hit the hotline if you want, 502-830-9195, if you want to share your comments that way. But until then, this has been another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.